Welcome to the Central Bank of Kuwait's podcast. I am Mariam Lumkhazim from the Central Bank of Kuwait. In this podcast, we aim to raise awareness on financial and economic concepts that affect people and our community as a whole. In this episode, we will discuss inflation, a term that has been subject to a hot debate recently. Central banks focus much of their attention to this indicator, as it has a great impact on our lives. To shed light on the various aspects of this topic, I'd like to welcome Fatma Al Ali from Central Bank of Kuwait. Repeatedly, we hear about inflation and its relation to price changes. Let's start by defining inflation, Fatma.
Thank you, Mariam, for giving me the opportunity to be here today. I'm happy to discuss inflation and how it affects us and the economy, as it's a pertinent topic. Inflation, as you mentioned, is a term that's common in economics. It indicates an imbalance in the economy. We can define it as a continuing increase in the price of goods and services during a given amount of time.
How can the consumer know if inflation is occurring, and how can inflation be calculated?
So to track inflation, we look at the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, which reflects the price of goods and services available to consumers. And this is where the Central Bureau of Statistics in Kuwait's job comes in. They complete a monthly review of the price of a basket of goods and services. This price basket is then compared monthly and annually to calculate the rate of inflation.
Fatma, can you give us an example of how inflation affects us as individuals?
The inflation rate is the annual change in prices, and a large increase in the rate means that the cost of living has increased. For example, we look at the price of a cup of coffee 5 years ago compared to today. This change in prices impacts the consumer's choices and preferences. If a person buys a product for 100 KD, then a year later notices that the price of the same product became 105 KD. That means the person is either going to pay 5 more KD or will buy less of the product with their 100 KD. The increase in the price means that the person has now lost some purchasing power.
Now that we understand inflation and how it can be measured, can you explain if inflation is driven by certain variables or happens at random?
Inflation doesn't happen overnight. There are contributors to the increase in inflation. The first is an increase in the demand of goods and services that exceeds supply. Second is an increase in production costs that affects the price of a product, such as an increase in energy prices, labor cost, and in the price of materials and transportation. Third, if a crisis were to happen that would affect the supply of products, such as wars, natural disasters, or a pandemic. And last is the scarcity of resources.
Clearly, inflation impacts people's lives immensely. How can inflation be controlled or reduced, Fatma?
Before we discuss how we can control inflation, let me start by saying that inflation and some moderate price increases are actually a sign of a healthy economy. Price increases actually encourage investment and increase employment levels, economic activity, and the availability of goods, and increases production. Moderate price increases do not have a big impact on the cost of living for low earners and pensioners. On the other hand, if inflation rates were very low, then the economy becomes at a risk of recession, which means wages as well as prices can be decreasing.
So Fatma, do governments and central banks interfere to control inflation?
Most governments and central banks have an inflation target of around 2%. And when inflation increases, central banks intervene using their various tools, taking into consideration the various factors driving inflation. However, some interventions such as raising interest rates can lead to a slower economic growth and an increase in unemployment. In other words, an economic recession paired with inflation, which is also called stagflation.
With all the information you mentioned in mind, how is the Central Bank of Kuwait acting on all this?
The Central Bank of Kuwait vigilantly monitors local and global economies, as well as geopolitical developments, for CBK to use their different policy instruments, including the discount rate and appropriate macroprudential tools to ensure financial stability. These instruments can limit price increases that result from imported inflation, which is inflation in other countries that affect the cost of products imported from these affected countries. They can also be caused by price increases that are a result of local monetary factors that increase demand of consumables and therefore increase prices, and growth in public spending and loans offered by the banking sector.
Are you saying, Fatma, there is a direct relation between interest rates and inflation?
The connection between interest rates and inflation is clear. Higher interest rates dampen the appetite for loans and encourage savings. Therefore, consumption of goods and services is reduced, demand falls as well as prices, and vice versa.
Thank you, Fatma Al-Ali, for this informative discussion of inflation and its impact on people and the community. And thanks to our listeners for joining us in this episode. This is Mariam Lumkhazim from the Central Bank of Kuwait's podcast.